The first of today's scripture is Mark chapter 14, verses 35 through 36. And going a little further, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that, if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. He said, Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, but what you want. The second is from Romans chapter 8, verses 12 through 17. So then, brothers and sisters, we are debtors, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of your body, you will live. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God. For you did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you received a spirit of adoption. When we cry, Abba, Father, it is very Spirit bearing witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ. If in fact we suffer with him, so that we may be glorified with him. And the third scripture is Galatians chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. My point is this: heirs, as long as they are minors, are no better than slaves, but they are the owners of all the property. But they remain under guardians and trustees until the date set by the Father. So with us, while we are minors, we are enslaved to the elemental spirits of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as children. Because you are children, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a child, and if a child, then also heirs through God.
Good morning again. So, like we said earlier, today is kind of a special day. Today is the day that we are celebrating Levi's birthday. His birthday is actually later on this week, on the 26th. But since we're heading out on vacation this week, we thought we'd have a little party, have some family, and have a good little time to celebrate this. And I know that this evening is all about Levi. It's really a celebration for him. But I do have to say, maybe somewhat selfishly, that to be able to celebrate Levi's birthday, particularly on Father's Day, this is kind of a big deal for me, personally. Having a child has not come particularly easy for Katie and me. In fact, for a lot of years, we weren't sure that it was ever going to happen, and outside of a few medical miracles, Levi probably wouldn't actually be here with us today. Father's Day is kind of a bittersweet day for me, because in some ways I carry a lot of that pain from previous years. And I really hurt for other people who carry that pain as well. And at the same time, I'm deeply grateful for and amazed by this little human being that calls me Daddy. Maybe it's because of some of my past experiences, but I'm just often aware of a lot of the little things of fatherhood. They're small things that might not seem like much, but that I just savor when I get the chance. For example, this week has been, well, something of a long and challenging week, but also a very rewarding week. Most of this week, Levi has been sick. He was running a temperature, and it's basically just a virus thing that is passing, but he's felt pretty awful for most of the week. Now, first of all, I will say that this week has had its challenges in a big way. We've had to try and juggle schedules just to get things covered, and he has been super fussy and frustrated a lot this week. You may have noticed that his voice is hoarse. That is because of several temper tantrums within the last couple of days. It's been a long week. And for the record, my wife is a saint because she has spent some very long days with him in the middle of that. Needless to say, there have been plenty of difficulties, but there have also been some interesting rewards this week. For all of the fussiness that there has been, there have also been some times where he just wanted to crawl up on my lap and curl up and cuddle for long stretches of time, which is something that he doesn't do all that much anymore and something that he won't do forever. Even in times where he has been the most frustrated and just crying and screaming at the top of his lungs, and because he hurts and he doesn't know why, or he has to take medicine, sometimes he would scream out, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy." And I don't like the fact that he's hurting or that he's screaming, but there is part of me that kind of loves the fact that when he says Daddy, he's referring to me. It's been an interesting week. Part of me has found him very difficult to deal with at times, but other times my heart just breaks for him, and I would do anything that I could to make him feel better. And at other times, I've had a closeness with him that I will treasure forever. The best word that I have to describe this week is that overall, I have shared an intimacy with my son that has been incredibly special to me. This week, as I've thought about Father's Day, it's this sense of intimacy that's really gotten me thinking. See, there are many images of God throughout the Bible. On Mother's Day, we talked about some of the feminine images of God throughout the Bible. And in this week, on Father's Day, it's not particularly difficult to do the opposite of that. There are many images of God as male throughout the Bible. In fact, that's probably the dominant image throughout the Bible. And yes, there are many images of God as a father throughout the Bible. But as I've thought about the use of father imagery in the Bible, what I've been particularly drawn to is this idea of having intimacy with God as a son has intimacy with their father. It's an intriguing thing to look at because the relationship between God and God's people has changed over time, particularly between the Old Testament and the New Testament. In the Old Testament, there are some references to God as the father of the people. But what's interesting is that there aren't that many references to God as Father. What's more, the relationship that the people have with God is not necessarily a close relationship. Certainly not close on the level of a father-son relationship. Now, part of this is rooted in their sense of who God is, and in particularly in the power and the greatness of God. In the Old Testament, God is so powerful and so holy that you don't even dare speak God's name, let alone talk directly to God. People have a fear of God in the Old Testament that is a genuine fear, not just a respect for God. God is often a distant and unknown entity that the people do not have direct contact with. They have to mediate their joys, their hopes, their concerns, their petitions, all of that through other people, through priests. If the people of Israel are the children of God, well, they don't necessarily have a relationship that would be described as particularly intimate. Which is one of the things that makes Jesus so fascinating. When Jesus comes on the scene in the New Testament, he speaks about his relationship with God in amazingly intimate terms. All over the place, Jesus starts referring to his relationship with God in terms of father-son relationships. And not only does he refer to God as his father, but does so in incredibly close kinds of ways. In the Gospel of John, he even says that I and the Father are one. Now, particularly for a Jewish mindset, at that point in time, when Jesus refers to God as Father, he's doing it in a way that would have been almost unheard of, and for a lot of people would have been deeply unsettling. In fact, when you look at the scene in the story where Jesus is brought before the Jewish courts, right before his crucifixion, the main questions, the main issues that they have with Jesus is to determine whether or not he really is referring to himself as the Son of God. And when he says basically yes, well, he is promptly sentenced to death for the sin of blasphemy. Jesus has a relationship with God that really breaks some new ground in terms of an intimacy between Jesus and God. And of course, some people would say, well, yeah, Jesus referred to God as his Father in an intimate kind of way. I mean, he's part of the Trinity. He is God in a way that other people are not. And to some extent, that's true. But what's interesting is that Jesus not only refers to his own relationship with God in these intimate fatherly terms, but he also gives license to his disciples to have that same kind of relationship. When the disciples ask Jesus how they should pray to God, he instructs them to begin by saying, "Our Father who art in heaven." Jesus not only has an intimate relationship with God, but he also opens the door for for everyday people, people like you and me, to be able to have a close, direct, and intimate relationship with God. And that was a strikingly new idea for the people in Jesus' day. Now, when we try and describe the intimacy that we see between Jesus and God, one of the things that often will come up is the use of the word Abba. A-B-B-A. Now, Abba is an interesting word because it's not actually a Greek word and it's not actually a Hebrew word. Abba is an Aramaic word, which, by the way, Aramaic is the language that Jesus would have spoken. What we have in the New Testament then, when we read the word Abba, is the sound of the Aramaic word put into the Greek alphabet and then put into the English alphabet when it gets translated into English. Which means that when you say the word Abba, it's one of the few times in the New Testament where you can actually hear the sound of the language that Jesus spoke, which to me is really cool. Now, the thing about Abba, in terms of its meaning, is that for a lot of years, some scholars have said that Abba is the equivalent of the English word daddy, a very familiar kind of word, a word that little children would have used to refer to their father. Now, in recent years, some scholars have found evidence that adults would have used this word as well, so it's maybe not quite the equivalent of daddy, but nevertheless, it is a strong term of intimacy and closeness, maybe closer to dad instead of daddy. Which is an idea that holds up when you look at how this word is used in the New Testament. There are 3 scriptures that we had for this morning. And those are the only 3 scriptures, or 3 times that the word Abba is used in the New Testament. And only one of which is Jesus using that word. Jesus uses the word Abba in the Gospel of Mark when he's praying in the Garden of Gethsemane and he's asking for God to not make him do what he knows is coming. And it's in that setting that he says, Dad, don't make me do this. It's an appropriate use of the word Abba in a very intimate setting. Where things take an interesting turn is the other 2 uses of the word Abba. Both of these come up from the Apostle Paul. One when he's talking to the Romans and one when he's talking to the Galatians. Now, in both of those scriptures, Paul is making a very similar point. He's basically saying that we are not just part of God's wider household, but rather we are part of God's family. We've been adopted by God. Another way to say it is that we are not just hired staff for God, but rather we are part of the family of God. We are heirs to the whole family fortune. And to show just how a part of the family we really are, he says that we have the right and the ability to cry out, Abba, Father, to God, which is something that hired staff would never have done. Paul, just like Jesus, is saying that we as ordinary mortals have the right and the ability to have such an intimate relationship with the creator of the universe that we could refer to God as our dad. It's a relationship with God that is less like some distant clockmaker and more like the relationship that I have with Levi. Which again was a drastically different way of thinking about our relationship with God than the people in Jesus' day would have been used to. For that matter, it's a different way of thinking about our relationship with God than most people would have today. When Paul says that we are now children of God, even to the point of being able to refer to God as Abba, he's making a couple of interesting points. On one hand, Paul is talking about our relationship with God and how God has welcomed us and embraced us as a part of God's family. But particularly in Romans, Paul is also using this language to talk about identity and behavior and what it means to be a child of God and not just an acquaintance of God. In the Romans version of this, Paul is talking about living in a new way and not doing the sinful things that we did before we joined the family of God. Paul is saying essentially that in every family has its own way of behaving, its own identity, its own set of rules. And the family of God is no different. Now that we have been adopted into the family of God, we take on this new identity as children of God, and there are expectations of behavior that go along with that, based on the family identity. We take on the identity of God, but that also, the identity as a child of God, but that also means that people look at us in a different way than before. Now, this is an idea that reminds me of a story from when I was a kid. Some of the most important conversations that I ever had with my dad happened in the pickup truck when we were driving from one place to another. Now, one day, when I was probably junior high-ish, we were driving from Gossel to Moundridge. Gossel's where I grew up, Moundridge is where he grew up, and it's worth knowing that both are excruciatingly small towns, where everybody knows everybody else, which means that not only did everybody in town know who my parents were, but they also knew who my grandparents were and my great-grandparents and everybody else in the family tree. It's one of those kinds of places. Now, as we were driving between the two towns, somehow the topic of conversation turned to family and our family history in the community. And I don't remember exactly how we got to this point in the conversation, and my guess is that my dad probably doesn't remember saying this, but at some point he said, "You know, Alan, it's worth knowing that the people in this community know our family pretty well, and that some people are probably going to treat you differently because of your last name." Now, I found this to be true on several different levels. On one hand, I can still walk down Main Street of Moundridge, find an old-timer, and say, "My dad is Brian Stucky," and he will say something to the effect of, "Oh, I remember in 1970, whatever, on the state championship basketball team, your dad was over there shooting this thing," and whatever. I've had that experience quite a few times. But that's not quite what my dad was saying. In the context of the conversation in the pickup truck, I think he was really saying, particularly that my grandfather and my great-grandfather had been relatively well known in that community for being relatively generous and kind, and that they had made a positive impact on the community, and people knew that and remembered it. And that he wanted me to know that that reputation was going ahead of me, even if I didn't really realize it. It was a statement of identity, but also a statement of how the family has functioned over the years. Now, to be sure, I don't think my dad ever really said anything like, "You know, you're a Stucky and you ought to act like it." But he simply said that our family has done things in a certain way over the years, and to some extent, I am now a part of that way of doing things. Now, to be sure, I've also had the opportunity to create my own identity over the years and to not do things in the way that my parents and my grandparents would have done things. But through it all, I've still had some sense that my actions and my choices are, in some way, shaped by my identity of what it means to be a part of the Stucky family. What I hear Paul saying in Romans is something very similar to that. Being a part of the family of God involves a good deal of freedom to be who we are, to be who God created us to be. But Paul is also saying that once you've been adopted into God's family, that there's a way that family functions, a way that people behave when you're a part of that family. It's a way filled with love and with grace and with turning away from sin. Being a part of God's family has its rewards and its privileges, but it also has its responsibilities and expectations, all of which stems from our identity as children of God. The example that Jesus gives us in the New Testament is that every single one of us can have such a close relationship with God that we don't have to go through priests or any other mediator in order to speak to God and to have that relationship. We can have a relationship with God so intimate that we can call God Abba, Father. It's a relationship that changes who we are, not because of a threat of punishment or reward, but rather we are changed because we're given a new identity. We join the family of God. And it is because of that status as a member of the family that we are called to live in a new way. A new way that is rooted in faith and hope and love. Amen.